Okay, good morning everyone and happy Sabbath. It's a privilege to be here again at Penrith. A bit emptier than usual, but I'd also like to wish everyone a happy Sabbath that's viewing today on live stream, because that's what most of you will be doing. But it's a privilege to be back here again at Penrith. And I'd just like to wish all our viewers a good blessing today as we jump into the message. Today we will be looking at some narrative history from the Bible, and the key characters are Esther, Mordecai, King Ahasuerus, who is also known as Xerxes, and I'll be referring to him as Xerxes from now on, and also Haman. It was written approximately 470 years before Christ in Persia, and Esther became queen 9 years earlier in 479 BC. Its author is anonymous, however, some believe that it was Mordecai, who was Esther's cousin and guardian, who wrote it, which makes sense. What was the purpose of the story of Esther? Why is it in the Bible? Now, a lot of people sometimes ask this. One of the main reasons is because when they discovered the Dead Sea Scrolls, the book of Esther was missing, but it still has its place. One of the reasons why it could have been missing is because the Jews actually read this entire book once a year, and it's a story of redemption. Its purpose is to demonstrate God's love and sovereignty in all circumstances. It's a post-exile story about Jews who stayed behind after most returned to Jerusalem in captivity. Babylon was conquered by Persia, and Esther miraculously becomes queen of the land and saves her people in this story. The book was written to Jewish people to record the origins of the Feast of Lots, or Purim as it was known. This annual festival commemorates God's salvation to the Jewish people, similar to their deliverance from the slavery in Egypt. The book was written to the Jewish people to record these origins of the Feast of Lots, or Purim, and it's an annual festival, so that's why it's read to them once a year, and it commemorates the salvation of God's people. The name Purim or Lots was likely given in a sense of irony, because Haman, the enemy of the Jews, who we discover later, had plotted to completely destroy them by casting the lot, and we'll find that later on in Esther chapter 9:24. But first, let's go to chapter 1. Open up there. We won't read yet, but I'll read a little bit of background from Ellen White's Prophets and Kings, because this shows the kind of landscape. It lays out the background for this story that we are about to begin reading. And here we go. Under the favor shown to them by Cyrus, nearly 50,000 of the children of the captivity had taken advantage of the decree permitting their return. Here you have the Jews. They got a free pass to go back to Jerusalem, and a lot of them did accept King Cyrus, who was the previous king in the Medo-Persian Empire. They accepted his special offer to go back to Jerusalem to finish their exile. These, however, in comparison with the hundreds and thousands scattered throughout the provinces of Medo-Persia, were but a mere remnant. So there was a lot more Jews spread across the empire. The great majority of the Israelites had chosen to remain in the land of their exile rather than undergo the hardships of the return journey and the re-establishment of their desolated cities and homes. And I understand it wasn't as easy as it is today to just simply grab your things and move. They didn't have the removal trucks that they could pack. It was, of course, a big move to go from where they were in exile back home, especially if they settled themselves, they had well-paying jobs or whatever they may have done. A score or more of years passed by when a second decree, quite as favorable as the first, was issued by King Darius Hystaspes, the monarch then ruling. Thus did God in mercy provide another opportunity for the Jews in the Medo-Persian realm to return to the lands of their fathers. The Lord foresaw troublous times that were to follow during the reign of Xerxes, the Ahasuerus of the book of Esther. And he not only wrought a change of feeling in the hearts of men in authority, but also inspired Zechariah to plead with the exiles to return. Ho, ho, come forth and flee from the land of the north, was the message given to the scattered tribes of Israel who had become settled in many lands from their former home. I have spread you abroad as the four winds of heaven, saith the Lord. Deliver thyself, O Zion, that dwellest with the daughter of Babylon. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, after the glory hath he sent me unto the nations which spoiled you. For he that toucheth you, toucheth the apple of his eye. The Jews were very important people to God still, the Israelites. And he continues, for behold, I will shake my hand upon them, and they shall be a spoil to their servants. And you shall know that the Lord of hosts has sent me. Zechariah 2, 6-9. It was still the Lord's purpose, this is still from Prophets and Kings, by the way, as it had been from the beginning, that his people should be a praise in the earth, to the glory of his name. The Jews and the Israelites had a tradition of representing God, whether they were with him or not with him. The outside nations would still see the Israelites as the God, as the people of the one true God, as they usually claimed to be. During the long years of their exile, he had given them many opportunities to return their allegiance to him. Some had chosen to listen to learn, and some had found salvation in the midst of affliction. Many of these were to be numbered among the remnant that should return. They were likened by inspiration to the highest branch of the high cedar, which was to be planted upon a high mountain and eminent in the mountain of the heights of Israel. Ezekiel 17, 22 and 23. It was those whose spirit God had raised, Ezra 1:5, who had returned under the decree of Cyrus. But God ceased not to plead with those who voluntarily remained in the land of their exile. So we see here that there is this effort that God is putting in to take God's people, the Israelites, back to their homeland, back to Zion. But a lot of people are like, we like it here. Like, there's no reason why we need to go back to Palestine or Jerusalem. We're good here. Like, everything's fine. There's no reason for us to go back. And God had to kind of struggle with that and give opportunities, open opportunities up for the people of Israel to go, oh yeah, it's time for me to go home. But a lot of people still failed to respond. And the large number, however, those who failed to respond to the decree of Cyrus remained unimpressible to later influences. So they kind of had their heart set on staying in Media Persia. And even when Zechariah warned them to flee from Babylon without further delay, they did not heed the invitation. That's what it says in Prophets and Kings. Meanwhile, the conditions in the Medo-Persian realm were rapidly changing. Darius Hystaspes, under whose reign the Jews had been shown marked favor, was succeeded by Xerxes the Great. It was during his reign that those of the Jews who had failed of heeding the message to flee were called upon to face a terrible crisis. Having refused to take advantage of the way of escape God had provided, now they were brought face to face with death. And that's how Ellen White opens up the background for the story of Esther. There was a reason why everything that happens in that story happens. Esther 1 verse 1 we'll read, and it starts off with a big banquet. Xerxes is celebrating, and we'll get into it by reading it straight from the word. This is what happened during the time of Xerxes. The Xerxes who ruled over 127 provinces stretching from India to Kush. At that time, King Xerxes reigned from his royal throne in the citadel of Susa. And in the third year of his reign, he gave a banquet for all his nobles and officials. The military leaders of Persia and Media, the princes and nobles of the provinces were all present. For a full 180 days, that's probably 6 months, he displayed the vast wealth of his kingdom and the splendor and glory of his majesty. When these days were over, the king gave a banquet lasting 7 days in the enclosed garden of the king's palace. For all the people from the last to the greatest, or the least to the greatest, were in the citadel of Susa. The garden had hangings of white and blue linen fastened with cords of white linen and purple material to silver rings on marble pillars. There were couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and other costly stones. This was a big bender, basically. It was a huge party, and it lasted an entire 6 months. Verse 7 even says, wine was served in goblets of gold, each one different from the other. Everyone had their own personalized cup. And the royal wine was abundant in keeping the king's liberality. By the king's command, each guest was allowed to drink with how many restrictions? No restrictions. It was an open bar. For the king had instructed all the wine stewards to serve each man as he wished. Queen Vashti also gave a banquet for the women in the royal palace of Xerxes. Now on the 7th day, when the king Xerxes was in high spirits from the wine, he commanded the eunuchs who had served him, Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcass, to bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown in order to display her beauty to the people and the nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger. Was Queen Vashti right to refuse the invitation or decline it? I think so. She knew why she was being called there. She knew that she was going to be taken advantage of. I have nothing against with the stand that Vashti took for herself in her own right. But unfortunately, this didn't resemble well with the king, nor did it resemble well with the nobles, and we'll find that out later. Since it was customary for the king to consult experts in the matters of law and justice, he spoke with the wise men who understood the times and were closest to the king. Karshnas, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsana, and Memucan, the 7 nobles of Persia and Media, who had special access to the king and were the highest in the kingdom. According to law, what must be done to Queen Vashti, he asked. She has not obeyed the command of King Xerxes that the eunuchs have taken to her. Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and peoples of the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all the women, and so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and Median women of the nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. So what these guys were telling the king is, Queen Vashti just pushed the boundaries If you let them be pushed, everyone will push them. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her a royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands, from the least to the greatest. The king and his nobles were pleased with this advice. So the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household, using his native tongue. Now, this goes to a part where the king starts looking for a new wife. And we'll go from chapter 2, and we'll go from verse 5. Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew from the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. Among these taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died. When the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Haggai. And guess what? Esther was among those women. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and entrusted to Haggai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately, he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. Now here, you don't just win someone's favor just like that. Esther must have been a very special character to be able to get along and resonate well with others. And we see that she even won the favor of the top eunuch in the king's harem. Immediately, he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants to the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her. Before a young woman's turn came to go to King Xerxes, she had to complete how many months of beauty treatment? 12 months. Wow. That's a lot of beauty treatments. 6 months with oil and myrrh and 6 with perfumes and cosmetics. Wow. Every time I read that, I still can't believe that it's a whole 12-month makeover, you could say, just to be fit to see the king. And this is how she would go to the king. Anything she wanted was given to her, with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening, she would go there, and in the morning, return to another part of the harem to the care of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not return to the king unless he was pleased with her and summoned by her name. When the turn came for Esther to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the harem, suggested. And Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her. She was taken to the king Xerxes in the royal residence in the 10th month, in the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign. Now the king was attracted to Esther more than any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And the king gave a great banquet, Esther's banquet, for all his nobles and officials. He proclaimed a holiday throughout the provinces and distributed gifts with royal liberality. And now here we're going to have another character added to the story. Esther chapter 3. Let's go. After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles. All the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman, for the king had commanded this concerning him. But Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, "Why do you disobey the king's commands?" Day after day they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. When Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews, throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes. In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is, the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select a day and month. This is a while after Haman already started this grudge with Mordecai. All this that we're reading here was taking years. It was 4 years after Vashti was disposed of, that Esther married Xerxes. After that, it was another 8 years where King Xerxes gets Haman to select this day and month. And the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, "There is a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them." It's funny how Haman worded this. He was very sly as he was trying to get his agenda across. "If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury." So the king took his signet from his finger and gave it to Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews. "Keep the money," the king said to Haman, "and do with the people as you please." Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various people. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by the couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day. The 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods was also something else they were allowed to do. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every provinces and made known to the people of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. There were numerous languages throughout that empire, and they were translated and given out to each people, each ethnicity that was under King Xerxes. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was what? Bewildered. Esther and the people of God had a powerful enemy in Haman. And this enemy was just granted a free ticket to the genocide of Esther and the Jews. What happens next? We'll find out in chapters 4 and 5. When Mordecai learned from chapter 4, all that had been done, he tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. This was, of course, noticed by Esther's servants. And let's read from verse 4. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. So she had to then find out why he was doing this. Then Esther summoned Hathach, this is verse 5 I'm reading from, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had proposed to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. And then he also said that this was given as a law throughout the empire and given to every language. And we then read that Mordecai also explained to show Esther and explain it to her, and he told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, all the king's officials and people of the royal provinces know that any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner courts without being summoned to the king has but one law, that they be put to death unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to the king. When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house that you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. These are the famous words that Mordecai said to Esther. And they're inspiring as well because Mordecai had great faith in God. He had faith that even if Esther wouldn't use her position as he wanted her to at first, he's like, that's all right. God will find another way. But this was an opportunity for Esther to also show her faith in God and also her love for God's people. Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai. Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. This was Esther doing her leap of faith, knowing that her life was at risk, even though she was going to go to her own husband. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. On the third day, Esther, this is going into chapter 5 by the way, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner courts of the palace. In front of the king's hall, the king was sitting on his royal throne in the hall facing the entrance. When he saw Queen Esther standing in the court, he was pleased with her and held out the gold scepter that was in his hand. So Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Then the king offers Esther up to half the kingdom. But Esther says in verse 4, if it pleases the king, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet I have prepared for him. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asks. Haman was obviously very impressed with this invitation, unaware of what Esther was about to ask for, and unaware of Esther's background as well. In verse 9, we see Haman returns home. Let's read. Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. Mordecai for Haman was that thorn in his flesh, you could say. Haman was so good, and then he sees that one person. Oh, it's you. Ugh. Haman was disgusted with Mordecai, only because Mordecai would not bow to him or show fear in his presence, as if Haman was some sort of God figure. Haman had a massive ego, we can see here, because Mordecai didn't really do any intentional harm to Haman. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together all his friends and Zeresh his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him and how he had elevated him above all the other nobles and officials. And that's not all. Haman added, I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave. And she has invited me along with the king tomorrow. But all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew Mordecai sitting at the king's gate. That was Haman's response. He still had that thorn in his flesh from Mordecai. Mordecai really did give him a stir. His wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, have a pole set up, reaching to a height of 50 cubits. Don't ask me why it was 50 cubits. I guess it was just to display it and showcase it. And asked the king in the morning to have Mordecai impaled on it. Impaling was not a nice way of killing someone, but that's what they wanted for Mordecai. Then go with the king to the banquet and enjoy yourself. This suggestion delighted Haman, and he had the pole set up. We go back to Prophets and Kings by Ellen White, and it will explain more about Haman. Through Haman the Agagite, an unscrupulous man high in authority in Medo-Persia, Satan worked at this time to counterwork the purposes of God. Haman cherished bitter malice against Mordecai, a Jew. Mordecai had done Haman no harm, but had simply refused to show him worshipful reverence. Scorning to lay hands on Mordecai alone, Haman plotted to destroy all the Jews that were throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes, even the people of Mordecai. Misled by the false statements of Haman, Xerxes was induced to issue a decree providing for the massacre of all the Jews, scattered abroad and dispersed among the people in all the provinces of the Medo-Persian kingdom. A certain day was appointed in which the Jews were to be destroyed and their property confiscated. Little did the king realize the far-reaching results that would have accompanied the complete carrying out of this decree. Satan himself, the hidden instigator of the scheme, was trying to rid the earth of those who preserved the knowledge of God. Satan didn't want the knowledge of God to be present among the people. He wanted it to be buried and buried quite deep. In every province whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes, just like Mordecai, Esther 4:3. The decree of the Medes and the Persians could not be revoked. Once the king, just like in the story of Daniel in the lion's den, once the king used his seal to verify a law, that was it. It wasn't to be reversed or taken back. What the king requested was what would be done. Apparently, there was no hope. All Israelites were doomed to destruction. That's what Ellen White says in Prophets and Kings. However, there is an intervention, and this is one of my favorite interventions that happens in the whole story. One of the best events that leads to a paradox involving Haman. This is found in Esther chapter 6. Something was keeping someone awake. And we all have those nights sometimes where we're in deep thought or something and we cannot sleep. This is what was happening to Xerxes that night. That night, the king could not sleep. And this is the night where Haman set up that pole, by the way, and he was ready to go and ask Xerxes for permission to have Mordecai impaled. So that night, the king could not sleep. So he ordered the book of Chronicles, the record of his reign, to be brought in and read to him. It was found, recorded, that that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this? Asked the king. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. Now, to know what this was all about, we need to go back to the end of chapter 2 in the book of Esther, a part that I've decided to save for now. Esther chapter 2, verses 19 to 23. When the virgins were assembled a second time, so this is when Esther was still being selected as the ideal wife for King Xerxes, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. For she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions as she had done when he was bringing her up. During the time Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate, Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, became angry and conspired to assassinate the King Xerxes. But Mordecai found out about the plot and told Queen Esther, who in turn reported it to the king, giving credit to Mordecai. And when the report was investigated and found to be true, the officials were impaled on poles. All this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. Here comes the hilarious part as we turn back to Esther chapter 6 from verse 4. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak with the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole that he had set up for him. It's pretty funny because we already know what's about to happen. His attendants answered, "Haman is standing in the court." "Bring him in," the king ordered. When Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there the king would rather honor than me?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe the king has worn and a horse that the king has ridden." Here Haman was having a little fantasy spell about what he wants. "One with a royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.'" "Go at once," the king commanded Haman. "Get the robe and the horse and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew." What? Massive jaw drop moment for Haman. He was shocked. "Who sits at the king's gate, do not neglect anything you have recommended." Haman must have just flushed red at that moment too. I have to do this all for Mordecai, the person I absolutely despise. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai, very reluctantly no doubt, and led him on horseback through the streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. And he told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. He obviously had his sook to his family and friends. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said this to him after this: "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. It is funny how Haman had this last warning. I believe that it shows how evil he really was. He did not listen to the advice given to him by his own family and friends. He was relentlessly going to carry on with the destruction of God's people. Here is the part where we can lose any sympathy for Haman if we ever had any for him. Going on to chapter 7. So the king and Haman went to Queen Esther's banquet. As they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, and if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition." The king must have had a head scratch moment there. What are you talking about? "And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king." King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary and enemy, this vile Haman." Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. The king got up in rage, left his wine and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Queen Esther was reclining. The king then exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she's with me in the house?" As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to the height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house." He had set it up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. And here we have a continued passage from Ellen White's Prophets and Kings. But the plots of the enemy were defeated by a power that reigns among the children of men. In the providence of God, Esther, a Jewess who feared the Most High, had been made queen of the Medo-Persian kingdom. Mordecai was a near relative of hers. In their extremity, they decided to appeal to Xerxes on behalf of their people. Esther was to venture into this presence as an intercessor. "Who knoweth," said Mordecai, "whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" The crisis that Esther faced demanded quick, earnest action. But both she and Mordecai realized that unless God should work mightily in their behalf, their own efforts would be unavailing. So Esther took time for communion with God, the source of her strength. "Go," she directed Mordecai, "gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast for me, and neither eat nor drink for 3 days, night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise. And so will I go unto the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish." The events followed in rapid succession. The appearance of Esther before the king, the marked favor shown her, the banquets of the king and queen, with Haman as the only guest, the troubled sleep of the king, the public honor shown Mordecai, and the humiliation and fall of Haman upon the discovery of his wicked plot. All these parts of a familiar story. God wrought marvelously for his penitent people, and the counter decree issued by the king allowing them to fight for their lives was rapidly communicated to every part of the realm by mounted couriers who were hastened and pressed on by the king's commandment. And in every province and in every city whatsoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land actually became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. Esther 8:14 and 17. More could be read from the book of Esther about the details of the aftermath. What Haman ordered could not be reversed. Let's remember that. But the Jews were given a right to defend themselves against those who persecuted them. They fought well, and by the will and the grace of God, this story of the girl who became queen, a queen of a foreign land, can teach us several things as followers of Jesus. God will always look after his own people. That's a promise God makes through this wonderful story. He will justly deal with his enemies and the enemies of his followers. Psalm 37 verses 1 to 9. "Do not fret because of those who are evil, or be envious of those who do wrong. For like the grass they will soon wither, like green plants they will soon die away. Trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land of the land and enjoy safe pasture. Take delight in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart." Wonderful promise that God gives us through David's psalm. Commit your way to the Lord, trust in him, and he will do this. He will make your righteous reward shine like the dawn, your vindication like the noonday sun. Be still before the Lord and wait patiently for him. Does God tell us to be anxious? No. He tells us to be still for him. Have peace. Do not fret when people succeed in their ways, when they carry out their wicked schemes. Refrain from anger and turn from wrath. Do not fret. It leads only to evil. For those who are evil will be destroyed, but those who hope in the Lord will inherit the land. It's a wonderful promise. Another point, the genuine people or enemies will see God and fear him, as we saw a lot of people in the Medo-Persian Empire under Xerxes actually became Jews. Let's be encouraged from this story and keep our relationship with God as our priority. Whatever our opposition or weakness is in our life, God can help deliver us from it. Sometimes in my personal life, I find it unfair how certain people of a certain type seem to be flourishing, doing well, while I'm here struggling. Nothing wrong is going on while I enviously watch struggling in my own affairs. If it's God's will, it will be taken care of. In this life or the next. We should do our part, however, and put our obedience in God's favor. Let God take care of our foes, our enemies, as the dangers are that we could distract ourselves and find ourselves as his enemies. If we get too preoccupied hating someone else, do we really love God? God died for everyone, right? Let's trust him. Let's obey him and surrender to his will. He promises to take care of us throughout the Bible in stories just like Esther. Let's show complete faith in our God, and we will be rewarded whether it's in this life or the next. Amen.